Hi, everyone. Happy Hanukkah to everybody, and welcome back to Israel Matters. How are you, Elliot?
I'm good. Hey, what can be bad? A holiday, extra food,
Fried
party,
food.
you know?
Because the miracle happened with oil, it's a custom that we eat a lot of fried food, and that's why,
Yes.
whether it's latkes, which are like fried potato pancakes, or jelly donuts, whatever the custom is, we eat a lot of fried food. It's not healthy, it's not good, but it's good.
But it's a miracle.
So anyway, once again, I'm Rabbi Wolicki, and with me is, of course, Elliot Chodoff, who is an expert in a lot of things, military strategy. He has worked extensively with the IDF, and he's also a tour guide, and he's been a lecturer at various universities over the years. I give different introductions every time, Elliot, but everyone knows
Well, I keep
who you
changing.
are. Just in case someone's new, they should hear something new about you. Before we get to some stuff that was in the news that's somewhat confusing, as always, I'd like to share a thought about Hanukkah. On Hanukkah, when we light candles for 8 nights, that's the way we commemorate this holiday. That's the observance of the holiday. And that's, of course, due to the fact that the miracle, the traditional story, the miracle of Hanukkah is that when the Hasmoneans, when the Maccabees reconquered the temple, when they retook the temple from the Assyrian Greeks, they cleaned up the temple and they could not find enough pure oil to light the candelabra, to light the menorah in the temple. And all they found was one little flask of oil that would have been enough only for one day. And it would take about a week to get fresh oil made and brought to Jerusalem. So they put the flask of one day's worth of oil into the menorah and they lit it, and miraculously the oil burned for 8 days. And there's lots of interpretations of the miracle. Now, when our custom today is that we light one candle on the first night, 2 candles on the second night, 3 candles on the third night, etc. And until we have 8 candles burning on the 8th night, increasing as we go. But in the Talmud, there's actually a dispute between 2 schools of thought, the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel, which were the 2 great academies during the end of the Second Temple period. And there were 2 schools of thought. So we follow the house of Hillel. That's 1, 2, 3, increasing every night till 8 candles. And the house of Shammai, they're of the opinion that we're supposed to light 8 candles on the first night, 7 candles on the second night, 6, 5, 4, 3. Eventually, on the last night, the 8th night of Hanukkah, we'd light only 1 candle. And there's lots of interpretations given for what exactly they're arguing about and what's the dispute really about. I just wanted to share one way of looking at it that I think has a deep lesson for any person of faith, which is this. There's 2 perspectives here. Let's say you're the Maccabees and you enter into the temple and you pull out that flask of oil and you look at that oil. How much oil is there? Well, 1 day's worth. You pour it into the menorah, you light it up, and you think it's going to burn for 1 day. A day passes, and now it's day 2, and it's still burning. And you say to yourself, wow, I thought there was only 1 day's worth. Miraculously, it was actually 2 days worth. And then the next day, it's still burning. And after 3 days of burning, you go, wow, I thought it was only 1 day's worth. It's actually 3 days worth. And then it keeps burning on the 4th day and the 5th day. So with each and every day, the perspective of the person witnessing the miracle as to how much oil there was increases. And ultimately, one who witnesses the miracle realizes when all is said and done that even though they thought there was only 1 day's worth of oil, in fact, due to God's providence, there were actually 8 days of oil. So the amount of oil, the amount of time the oil could burn increased with every day from the perspective of the people witnessing the miracle. But now let's take a look at the very same miracle from God's perspective. God knew what he was going to do. So when they find that flask of oil, how much oil is actually there? Enough for 8 days. They pour it in, they light it up. After 1 day, how much oil is left? 7. After 2 days, 6. From God's perspective, who knew that it would last 8 days, the amount of oil was diminishing. From the human perspective, the amount of oil that was put in there was increasing. This miracle, we can look at it from God's perspective or from the human perspective. And sometimes with miracles that happen in our lives or in history, our perspective and God's perspective can be complete opposites. They can run in opposite directions. We don't get it. We're interpreting things as they go. God knows beforehand how things are going to play out, and our perspective can be completely flipped around. And this dovetails nicely with probably something that you heard in your Jewish education growing up, and I heard in mine, which is that in the future, it's some eschatological teaching that at some point at the end of times, we're going to switch opinions and follow the opinion of the house of Shammai. And I think what that really means in light of this interpretation is that we're going to have a different perspective, and we're going to understand God's perspective on miracles. I think it's just a lesson about miracles in general. We don't understand them. There's a great line in the Talmud that says that the last person to recognize a miracle is happening is the person that it's happening to. Generally when things happen in our lives, we don't know what on earth is going on, and sometimes years go by and we look back and go, oh, that's what God was doing. And that's really getting God's perspective that he already knew. So I wanted to share that thought. I thought it was an interesting interpretation.
Nice. I like it.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Elliot. Now, to the news. I'm confused because last week I was all excited. Forgive me. I'm a Jew living in Israel. I was excited because I read the news, and in the news, there was a story. It's about, I think, 8 days ago, that said that Khamenei, I don't know how to pronounce his name.
Khamenei.
How do you pronounce it? Khamenei, okay. The supreme leader of Iran, the second, as you pointed out last time, we forget the fact that since the Ayatollah Khamenei led the revolution in the late 70s until today, there have only been 2 supreme leaders of Iran. That Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, the Ayatollah, was so sick that he was on his deathbed and that he was stepping down and even appointing his son as an interim replacement. And then a few days later, there was this denial that there was anything wrong. And there's a news story that comes out that Iranian officials close to his office said that he's in perfect health, and any reports of his imminent demise were incorrect, and he's going about his daily business as usual. So I don't know what on earth is going on, but it also led me to wonder if it even matters. And so I want to throw this out to you. Like, how do you interpret what we saw? And does it even matter who the supreme leader is?
Does it matter who the supreme leader is? Somewhat. That there is a supreme leader is important. And I think it's important to understand what that means, especially since we tend to think of titles in sort of state parallels. The Israeli president is the parallel of a monarch, in a sense, ceremonial position.
You mean a monarch in the modern sense, the way
the constitutional monarchy.
Right, and sometimes that's confusing to Americans who are like,
because the American presidency is an entirely different position. What is a prime minister? What does that mean? And let's start with, in democracies, because not every country that has a prime minister is a democracy. In democracies, you have essentially 2 different general forms. There are many variations of parliamentary democracy versus sort of the American style. I don't want to go into a sharp breakdown there, but let's start here. Let it be sufficient to say that the title of a position does not give it equivalency across systems. So the president of the United States is different from the president of Israel position-wise. There is no prime minister in the United States. In fact, the prime minister is not the same thing as the president. So we have to be very, very careful as far as that goes. Now, let's go over to a non-democratic regime like Iran. And let's go even further to a theocracy like Iran. And let's go even further than that, to a Khomeinist theocracy in Iran.
What do you mean by Khomeinist? Because, I would think a theocracy is a theocracy.
No. So first of all, different religions, different branches of religion, different ideas. Up until 1648, the Pope was a major political player in European politics. Khomeini in the 1960s and into the 70s developed an idea. We talked about this a bit, and I think it bears
a few months ago, yeah.
He wrote a book called Islamic Government, and he created a concept, a position called the jurist, or the overseer, would be another way of putting it. And what he said was that when there's an Islamic state, there hadn't been one yet, Shiite. It's an idea that he essentially adopted from the Sunnis. So that state needs to appoint a supreme religious political leader. Now, this is a whole new, radical new concept for Shiites. Shiites never had this before. And he created this conceptual position, which he then later filled, called Waliyat al-Faqih, or the rule of the jurist. By the way, Faqih is similar to the Hebrew Mifakeh, overseer.
Uh-huh.
Okay? Supreme in the sense of overseeing all.
Yeah, but it's interesting that the title is jurist, implying that there's an existing Islamic law that he's merely implementing.
He must be an Islamic scholar.
Got it.
Okay? There is no separation of church and state. Now, the term Ayatollah, maybe we should start with that, is a religious title. It's a scholar of Islam. It's one who has reached a certain level of scholarship. So all, I mean, it has a meaning, but all Ayatollah means is that you've achieved a certain religious level of scholarship.
Okay.
Now, among the Ayatollahs, there are those who are looked upon as particular scholars to give rulings. And we're familiar with this in Judaism as well.
Sure.
Right? Rabbi, with all due respect, is a certain
right. It's not the same as Dayan, who is
Dayan
or Posek.
Or a posek, right? A posek being one who can issue. Now, a rabbi can issue, but nobody may listen to.
In other words, just to explain to everyone, as a general practitioner, rabbi, as it were, if someone comes to me with a question that is not clearly adjudicated in the books available to me in this library, I don't make the ruling myself. I contact a posek or a dayan, and I pose the question to them, and they issue a ruling.
These are authorities.
Right, exactly.
Okay. And throughout history, now again, in Israel, it's a little bit more structural because there's a political aspect to a rabbinate and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
but
it's a little different.
Okay, but historically, the higher level authorities were higher level authorities because they were recognized by all the other authorities. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a structure in the sense of you knew the appointment. It was he's the guy you go to because he's the guy.
Right, for sure.
He's the guy, right? Okay. So there's an element of that in the Shiite world as well. And such a religious scholar leader is an Ayatollah, but who gets the additional title of Marja el-Taqlid. For our purposes, one who has the ability to make these sorts of rulings on a religious level. And Khomeini was one as well. And he argued that such a religious leader, one of them, meaning himself obviously, should ultimately be appointed the Wali al-Faqih, the supreme leader, not of the Islamic State, but of all Shiites. And it's a political leadership, not a religious one. Through his political leadership, he is also the religious leader, not the other way around.
That's interesting.
Okay. Now, when he died, Khamenei, who is an Ayatollah, was appointed the Wali al-Faqih, but he is not seen on the same religious scholar as Khomeini was.
Oh, interesting.
Okay, and there are many now. There are.
Wait, who appoints him?
Okay, the council appointed him, but Khomeini basically fingered him.
Got it.
And remember, Khomeini was the man. What he said was it. Now, why did he pick him? There are all sorts of theories, but he knew that he was politically reliable. And now there are three groups within Shiism in relation to Khamenei. First of all, there are the anti-Khomeinists, and this is something that's really important for us to keep in mind. In Iran and in other places, there are those who don't accept Khomeini's Islamic government. So, in the West, we used to talk about the Sunnis and the Shiites as if they're, that's the two sides of the conflict. But the Shiites are not monolithic any more than the Sunnis are monolithic. And there are many. The Amal movement, for example, in Lebanon, opposes Khomeini's Waliyat al-Faqih. Okay, so close by.
Now, does that mean that that Shiites who reject Khomeinism don't pay any attention to the teachings and rulings of the Ayatollahs in Iran, or they just don't accept that one political aspect of it?
Exactly. So they may accept the rulings of Ayatollahs who follow Khomeini. They may accept the rulings of Ayatollahs who oppose Khomeini. And there are those who sort of fall in the middle. There's an Ayatollah in Lebanon, Fadlallah, who is looked upon as a religious leader by Hezbollah, but he is not a clear supporter of the Khomeini doctrine. He's not in opposition. He leans toward it, but he's not part of the operation. Okay, and I mention all of this. I know it's very confusing, but I mention it because it should be confusing. We shouldn't have this very clear idea of how neatly it all falls. You have those like Hezbollah and others who follow Khamenei as Wali al-Faqih, but they don't accept his religious rulings because he's not on a high enough religious level.
Interesting.
And that's created a bit of misunderstanding in the West because they didn't know to separate these two positions. And the fact that he's supreme leader gives him supreme political authority, but on the equivalent of what we would ask about Shabbat or Kashrut, they wouldn't go to him.
I see.
I'm simplifying, but I think
no, I get it.
Okay. Now, does it matter who will take over from him? It does kind of, but as long as that person is a Khomeiniist, it's not going to change much about Iran.
Now, is it going to be the same type of thing as with Khomeini, where Khamenei is going to finger someone and say he's my successor, and then it's just a rubber stamp?
Because he doesn't have the personal authority that Khomeini had. He has the political authority. In other words, in his position, he's supreme. But when he dies, it's not going to carry the same weight that Khomeini's word did. So he may try to appoint his son. It may or may not work.
But I was reading actually that his son is not considered enough of a scholar, and that there's actually someone else that that Khamenei himself has named as a potential successor.
My guess is that Khamenei understands the weakness that he had because he wasn't considered to be sufficiently scholarly, and that he will probably want somebody who's more recognized scholarly than he was to bring more stature to the position.
That's interesting. Now, how does this, I know that Iran also has a president. Like I remember we had that guy, Ahmadinejad, for a while, and then he was replaced by the current guy, Rouhani, who's very well groomed. He's like the, the neatest and tidiest of the guys from Iran. So I know that the president of Iran is not a ceremonial position like in Israel, like the Queen of England, but he's also not the supreme leader. So how does that power?
Okay, so he's the chief executive, and he runs things day to day. And the supreme leader doesn't interfere with the day-to-day running of things. And by the way, for a parallel for us, he doesn't interfere with the day-to-day runnings of Hezbollah either. Okay, in other words, the head of the system, whether it's the Iranian state or the Hezbollah organization, runs the system. But they run it within parameters of knowing what he wants. If there's a dispute that comes up, a political dispute, and again, I'll use the Hezbollah example, when they were debating whether to go into Lebanese politics or not, they ultimately went to Khamenei to get his approval. Okay, so he certainly has the last word. Let's also remember that here, very similar to, I hate to use the analogy, but structurally it works, and I'm going to use it, Nazi Germany. There are forces that answer directly to the supreme leader and not to the president. The Revolutionary Guards are subordinate to the supreme leader, not to the state.
Right, and from what you're describing, it sounds like Nasrallah, as the head of Hezbollah, would also answer directly to the supreme leader, because the president is governing Iran, not governing all the tentacles of the Iranian global machine.
That's right, and Hezbollah does it via the Quds force of the Revolutionary Guards to the supreme leader. Okay.
Okay. So how much autonomy does the president have? Meaning, let's put it this way. I just asked if it matters who the Ayatollah, who the supreme leader is. Does it matter who the president is?
No, it matters much less who the president is.
I see. Because he's much more being the top bureaucrat rather than being the top decision maker.
I like Ahmadinejad. I like honest murderers.
Yeah, he was really he was quite inflammatory. He
was
wasn't
out
trying
there
to present himself as a moderate.
I hate guesswork.
Yeah. That's interesting.
But remember, everybody who runs for president has to be vetted by the supreme leader. So the spectrum that you hear in the West, from extremist to moderate, is a very, very narrow sort of spectrum, because anybody who's too far over on the moderate side doesn't get into the election. The supreme leader vets them and rejects them. So in that sense, anybody who becomes president is the supreme leader's guy.
Got it.
So, again, you can always say, well, but what if it's somebody who's completely different liberal? It's not going to happen. Is it possible? Well, when anybody asks me, is it possible? I always ask, when you toss a coin, you ever bet side? Now, it's possible.
Yeah, there is a number placed on that probability, but that doesn't mean that it's ever going to happen. So wait a second. The president is governing the country. He's answering to the supreme leader. The supreme leader.
Let me try to put it in.
Go ahead.
The supreme leader decides on objectives and grand strategy. The president is allowed to decide on tactics. Okay, in other words, once the framework is set, he's got autonomy to operate within the framework. But he can't diverge from the framework. And if something new comes up, and even something not new, he's consulting. The supreme leader's word is in there. Now, he's probably not calling him every day and telling him how to do things, but he's overseeing it. He's seeing directions, and his general position is clearly out there and known to the president.
So, I want to point out something that's interesting about this, because when we think about dictatorships, where someone has supreme power and is in there for life, like a supreme leader,
Right.
generally what you have is things like Syria with Assad,
Correct.
or Muammar Gaddafi back in the day when he was in Libya. You have people who are in total, they're all powerful, but they were also not chosen by any kind of council. They kind of rose to power through brute force. Or like Kim Jong-un out in Korea, and they seize power, and then they often bequeath it to their children, like in the case of Assad.
Right.
And
they
many
create
others.
dynasties.
Right. Now, you can have a dictator like Vladimir Putin, who was elected under much more democratic circumstances, and he has proceeded to destroy those circumstances so that he can't be removed. But that's also, he broke the system in order to remain in power. It sounds like in Iran,
Hitler did the same thing.
Right. So those are two templates. It sounds like in Iran, we have a different template altogether, which is that the supreme leader was chosen. He's not the son of the Ayatollah Khomeini.
No.
He had to be voted in to the supreme leader position by the other Ayatollahs.
By a council, that's right.
Which means there was a council that consented. He didn't seize power in some violent way. This isn't a mob boss killing off everyone else.
No.
In the style of some other people he's not Vladimir Putin, and he didn't inherit it from his father. And that makes for a very interesting system. So it's kind of a dictatorship by design.
Think of the election of the Pope. Where the cardinals elect the Pope, but once the Pope is elected, he's supreme.
So is there, one more question, and then we'll try to move towards wrapping this up, just to understand the way the system works. Because if we are heading towards a transition, and it's going to be in the papers, there's going to be a lot of words and terms thrown out there, and this is very helpful, Elliot, everything you're saying, just so that when the day comes, because it seems from reading between the lines that he is sick, and he's been sick for a while.
Yes.
So,
and he's not young. He's not young.
He's not young. He's 81 years old. Even though they're claiming he's in perfect health, we know that that it's more imminent than they're claiming. So when the day comes and this happens, just to get a sense of how this is going to work, should we expect there to be some kind of unrest?
No.
Okay. Do we know anything about the possible successors? Meaning, is enough known publicly about these people that we have any sense of them, or they're not really personalities that we're aware of?
I'm not aware of it, and I wouldn't spend a lot of time, and I'll tell you why. We're in the West. We're used to one of two possibilities in the outcome of elections. Either, and I don't mean individual, and I'm not talking about the current specifically, but I'll use the current as part of the overall model. Either there's continuity or the other side comes in. When I say continuity, I mean either a president is reelected for a second term, or their party wins after they're no longer running. That's continuity. The alternative is what we have now and what happened when Trump defeated Clinton, and when Obama came into office, and when Bush came into office, was Democrat, Republican, and so on. There's a certain amount of turbulence, and I don't want to go into American politics, but I want to use the model here. But let's understand that this is not possible in Iran. Whoever becomes the Ayatollah is going to be a continuation of Khamenei. And that's why I said before, it doesn't matter all that much. I'm not going to say it doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter all that much, because it's going to be a political, ideological, religious heir to what has already been. Will he take it a little this way? Will he take it a little that way? Will he be a little more charismatic, a little less charismatic? Those are important questions, but they're not the critical core questions that we're used to asking. And again, I don't want to get into American politics, but we all know Trump or Biden, these are
yeah, there's a big difference.
questions of weight.
Right.
Here, this guy or that guy, not so much.
Yeah, in other words, to use your terminology, the other side getting in isn't an option. There is no, other
there is
side.
no other side.
Right. Interesting. So what role does the Council of Ayatollahs play?
So they will ultimately appoint the next one, but they're all part of the same team. In other words, this is not there may be individual, political, personal conflicts or rivalries, but there's no left and right. There's no conservative liberal.
Got it.
These are all hardliners.
Okay. All right, Elliot, this was very helpful.
All right.
And we don't know when there's going to be news. And of course, there's some news we didn't get to. There's some new peace deals going on.
Yes.
And
They'll still be around next week.
Yeah, it'll be around next week, and who knows what's going to happen. But it seems that the Trump administration, even in its last, if it is the end, in its final weeks, is still moving ahead, bringing more and more peace to our region, and thank God for that. So happy Hanukkah, everyone! Thank you very much again,
Happy
Elliot.
Hanukkah.
Thank you, everyone, for watching. Please share this and tell everyone about it, and have a wonderful and safe winter and a safe Hanukkah. And hopefully we will be talking to you again next week. But to our Christian viewers, you're already putting up your lights. So Merry Christmas. Have a good one. God bless everyone.